This video is meant to be a short introduction to the three writers that we have this week. I call them other writers because these are writers who are working outside the mainstream of American fiction after the Civil War. We have two African American writers, one of whom is not actually a writer of fiction at all. And we have a Native American writer who writes both memoir and fiction, as well as poetry and an opera. So I hope you'll find it interesting. The map that you see here is a contemporary one. This shows where all the Indian reservations are in the United States. You can see there's a little tiny group of reservations still in Florida. At one time, of course, Native Americans or American Indians lived all over the country, but because of 17th and 18th and 19th century policies and wars and disease, Indians were gradually pushed west, sometimes because the land that they owned or the land that they lived on was simply taken by white people, and other times through government action, such as the famous Trail of Tears that came through Missouri during the Andrew Jackson presidency, where Indians from Florida and Georgia were forcibly removed to Oklahoma. And then over time, even those reservations were shrunk as other Americans, white Americans, were interested in minerals or in oil or in just simply the land itself. And so you can see here how maldistributed Native Americans are in the United States even today. The largest single reservation is the Navajo Nation down here in Arizona and New Mexico. And the smallest reservation is actually a cemetery in Massachusetts, something I didn't know until I found this map. Here's our Native American writer, Zitkala-Sa, or to go by her anglicized name, Gertrude Simmons Bonnin, who lived from 1876 to 1938. These two are photographs of her when she was in her 20s, when she first became prominent as a writer, as an activist, and she was also a teacher, a music teacher at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. This gentleman over here is her husband, Ralph Bonnin, who she married in the 1890s. He was an Army officer, and in fact, he was stationed at an Indian reservation with her for 14 years. And in 1916, he was forced out of his job because of his and her activism over the rights of Indians. He himself was a quarter Sioux. She was half Sioux, as you know from the introduction to our textbook. These photographs were taken by Gertrude Casavere, and they're very famous late 19th century photographs. You can see the romantic kind of style that they're given, the intentionally artistic effects that they have. I had never read this writer until I decided to add her into the course, and I've been quite struck by her force as a writer and as an activist. And she must have been a formidable presence if these photographs are any indication. She was educated from the age of 8 at an Indian school in Indiana, and then eventually went to the famous Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. During this period of time in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, thousands of Native American children were moved away from their families, had their hair cut, had to adopt Western clothes, Western in the sense of, traditional American kinds of clothing, and were forbidden to speak their own language or to practice their own religious or other cultural customs. So during this period of time, there were literally thousands and thousands of Indians who simply lost their identity. And of course, this was highly controversial among Indians, not among white people who thought this was the best way to approach them. And of course, other countries have done the same thing as well. Australia and New Zealand, for example, tried similar experiments with their natives, the Maoris and the Aborigines who lived there. Not successful, okay? As I said, she was a teacher of violin and music, and she became a concert-level violinist early in her life and maintained that interest in music for much of her life. She also founded a couple of different Indian advocacy organizations, and that took her and her husband, after he was fired by the by the what would the forerunner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They lived in Arlington, Virginia, which is actually where my wife and I used to live when we were stationed in Washington for about half her life. And this gave her the ability to lobby in Congress and lobby with the Department of the Interior to protect Indian lands and expand their legal status. You may or may not know that Native Americans, American Indians, were not considered citizens of the United States until 1924. And she was instrumental in getting that act passed that allowed Native Americans to become citizens and then also allowed them to vote. This headstone, by the way, is in Arlington Cemetery, where actually I have 6 members of my family buried. Since her husband was an Army officer for a period of time, she was buried there, and then he's buried in the same tomb when he died in 1942. Textbook, we have 2 examples of her writing. The first is from a memoir, Impressions of an Indian Childhood, that was published in the Atlantic in 1900. We have a couple of chapters of that. It was an extended but still relatively short memoir, and it talks about where she grew up in South Dakota, a reservation that's still there. You may know it better as one of the reservations that was involved with the pipeline disputes over the past few years, over the I can't remember the name of the pipeline all of a sudden. It went right out of my head, but you know what I'm talking about. And so she talks about that experience. She also talks about when she leaves to go to the East, first to Indiana and later to Carlisle, to become educated. It's the only kind of education that a Native American could have received in the end of the 19th centuries by leaving the reservation and going away and adopting these other ways. Interestingly enough, she and her husband advocated for the founding of Indian schools on Indian reservations, and that eventually came to pass in the 20th century. And so that's the start of such things as not just Indian K through 12 schools, but rather Indian community colleges and tribal colleges that are located on dozens of Indian reservations in the United States. So we have an example of her as a memoirist. Then we also have one of her short stories. She wrote many. Called The Soft-Hearted Sioux, and this is about a young person who makes a journey similar to hers in the sense that he leaves a reservation, goes east to be educated, and then comes back as a Christian missionary to evangelize among his own people. And he becomes in that process a kind of outcast. He's not fully Indian, he's not fully American or white, quote unquote. But he's ostracized by both sides, and it's a sad story in many ways about a man who's caught between his native culture and his new culture, an old religion and a new one. And so it's actually a fascinating story, but as I said, a very sad one. But it does reflect in part what Zitkala-Sa's own experience was in the sense of leaving and going away, although she was never quite the dedicated religionist as the character that we meet in the story. She wrote operas, she wrote plays, she wrote poetry, she wrote other fiction as well. And much of her work was collected into a large volume in 1921 called American Indian Stories. And that's where both of these 2 texts come from. Racially, Native Americans were classified after the Civil War and in most of American society as white. They were segregated on reservations, but they could still live pretty much where they wanted to in towns and cities, although there were many areas, particularly in the South and in the West, where this was not the case, where Native Americans were discriminated against. But probably no group was really discriminated against as much as African Americans. Of course, they arrived in the United States in 1619 as slaves in Virginia at the Jamestown colony, and then remained largely slaves in the United States up until 1865, until the end of the Civil War. One of perhaps the most powerful figures in American history, particularly with regard to African Americans, is Frederick Douglass. He escaped from slavery in 1838 and published the first of several autobiographies called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. This happened to come out about 7 years before Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by a white abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe from Massachusetts, about the evils of slavery. And it's one of the books that impelled the Civil War. The book that inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe was Frederick Douglass's book. And this book underwent a variety of revisions and different titles and things in Douglass's lifetime. It's not in our textbook because, of course, our textbook starts after the Civil War. And most of Douglass's writing was done before the Civil War, and almost all of it is memoir or speeches or articles that he wrote that advanced the things that he was interested in. He was very much an abolitionist, especially having escaped from slavery. Interestingly enough, he was a suffragist in that he supported the right of women to vote. And this is unusual for a man before the Civil War. It's almost unheard of for an African American man to be in this kind of position in public. But as I said, he gave thousands of speeches over the years, and that's really kind of how he made a living. He also was a journalist in the sense that he wrote a great deal for abolitionist and suffragist publications. But he was probably the most prominent African American public figure of the 19th century. No single person was probably more influential than he up until the end of the 19th century. And as we'll see, he's the mentor to Paul Laurence Dunbar, and he's also the inspiration of much of the work of W.B.E. Du Bois. Okay. He did have a government position. He was an informal advisor to the federal government before and after and during the Civil War. He was an advocate for the formation of what later became U.S. colored troops. St. Louis, interestingly enough, was one of the first depots created to recruit and train what became the U.S. colored troops in 1863 and 1864. And as you know from my talk on the Civil War, there were 180,000 African Americans serving in the Union Army at the end of the war. His official government position was a short one, and it came late in life. He was made the U.S. Minister to Haiti, which, as you probably know from other history classes, was where the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere has ever been held, with the rise of Toussaint Louverture overthrowing the French and forming the country of Haiti in 1803. But we may talk about Douglass. For some of us, this may be very difficult history when we talk about the period in American life that runs from about the end of Reconstruction in 1876 up until the 1960s, where in many parts of the United States, blacks and whites were formally segregated. They lived in different parts of town. They didn't go to the same schools. They couldn't go to the same hospitals. They couldn't even in some cases use the same stores. If they were traveling on a bus or a train, they had separate cars, separate seating areas. They had separate restrooms, separate drinking fountains. It's enormously complicated history. And of course, many of you know that the kinds of patterns of development in cities like St. Louis are very much remnants of this segregated past. I grew up in San Diego, where we didn't have any of the kinds of restrictions that we had here in Missouri. My wife is from Crystal City, and she grew up in a time when, in her early years, the schools were segregated in the town that she comes from in Jefferson County. And that was the case all through the state, and indeed in many other states. Some of the images I have for you here, this is one from a bus station, and we have a colored waiting room. You know, this is where only they could sit. You would have seen signs for colored drinking fountains, for colored restrooms as well. If you go to an older building, something built, before the 1960s, almost invariably you'll notice in the South and in lots of the Midwest, you'll notice that there'll be like 4 bathrooms or four rooms that look remarkably similar. and two of those will be bathrooms. The other two used to be bathrooms back in the days of segregation. I remember being in a train station in Raleigh, North Carolina, 40 years ago when I was in graduate school, and that's when I first noticed it. In the Pentagon, where I worked in the 1990s, there's double the number of bathrooms than there should be for the number of people who work there, which is about 50,000. And you'll notice that if you walk down the corridors, it's just bathroom after bathroom. And it comes from the days when the building, since it's in Virginia, was segregated. The cafeterias were integrated, but the bathrooms were not. But you can see the kinds of things that this caused people to do. Advertising, stores, restaurants would say, "We cater to white," or "colored entrance around the back," or something like that. This is a laundry sign. You may have seen the movie Green Book that came out a year or two ago, and that refers to a travel guide that was put together from the 30s until the 60s that listed for African American motorists where they could get gas, where they could go to the bathroom, where they could spend the night, where they could go to a restaurant or a resort where Black people were permitted. And this was published as a nationwide guide for decades. And this is an example of a cover from the 1957 edition. Okay. The other name for this formal segregation was called Jim Crow, named after a minstrel figure from the 19th century who was sort of a caricature of a Black person. We don't always think of Missouri as a southern state, and Missouri, frankly, doesn't have anything to do with the three writers that we're working with, but it might be helpful to put some of these things into context for you. This map in the middle shows what states had segregated school systems in 1950. This is before the famous 1955 Brown versus Board of Education. The Deep South, it was absolutely required that schools would be segregated, and you notice that Missouri is one of those states that's also where the schools are segregated. Kansas, they were segregated in some parts, not in others. Same thing with Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. Some places they were segregated, some they weren't. California, Nevada, Oregon, states like that, there were really no laws about these things. But there was very little formal segregation. The blue states in here were ones where no segregation was permitted by law in the school systems. Of course, this doesn't take into account informal segregation by neighborhood or by town, or by occupation, but it does give you an idea of the extent of just where these Jim Crow laws were in place. The Deep South, Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, these were the kind of places where you would have found these formal segregation laws. A couple of interesting things that I found out as I was putting this together. The first is I found this map of lynchings in Missouri, and we have the second highest number of lynchings. These are, hangings, extrajudicial hangings of Black Americans by white people. We had the second highest outside of the Deep South, which is not a statistic that I think we'd like to bandy about. If you notice, the center, the darkest part of this is where most of the lynchings occurred. This is in the famous Little Dixie part of Missouri. If you take 70 out and you go towards Columbia and you keep going, you'll see little signs up that say Little Dixie. And that's supposedly the most southern part of Missouri, not geographically, but in terms of attitude. And you can see why it got that name, because that's where the lynchings occurred. Missouri, as you probably know from your history classes, was the only state that had a star in both flags, in the Confederacy and in the Union flag during the Civil War. And this might give you an idea about just what that means. You'll also notice that there's a pocket of lynchings in southeast Missouri, which geographically is the most southern part of the state. It's right on top of Arkansas, as you know, and close to Tennessee, a border state in the Civil War, but both slave states. And Missouri was a slave state too during the Civil War. So some of these racial attitudes take a long time to disappear. This is a map of St. Louis, and you can see St. Louis County and City, and you can see that the green parts are the affluent areas, West County, South County, out towards Wildwood, Gray Summit, that kind of stuff. And you can see where the poverty pockets are. North City, near North County, and then further as you go into some of the other outlying North County areas. And this is largely a remnant of the segregated housing policies in St. Louis City and County that really weren't overthrown until the 1950s and 60s. Well, what does all this have to do with our writers? I call these other writers because these are outsiders. These are not mainstream writers. They're not the kind of people, except maybe Du Bois and maybe Frederick Douglass, who get studied in every literature course that's like this one. Um, they might get mentioned in passing, or they might get more emphasis now that we're more conscious of um, how we have let race and gender or status kind of get in the way of what's literature and what's not. Paul Laurence Dunbar is kind of a bridge figure, very popular poet in his time, then forgotten and then kind of come back to life, as it were, here in the 2000s. Um, he's he is born during, of course, the life of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, but he doesn't write poetry that's anything like theirs. He's certainly not influenced by them at all. He's also born in Dayton, Ohio, so he's in a part of the country where you don't have the kind of de facto segregation that you have in the Deep South. It turns out his best friend in high school, this is something I learned as I was putting this together, is Orville Wright. They were close until Dunbar died in 1906. He was also the only black in his high school class. Dunbar was. I'll show you a picture of that. He's a prolific writer, begins to write when he's very young, when he's in high school, puts together a book of his poems and goes to the Chicago Exposition, the famous Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And he brings along hundreds of copies of his book, which he sells and is quite successful. People buy them. And he meets Frederick Douglass and becomes his assistant for a period of time. And he publishes some more poetry and then comes to the attention of William Dean Howells, who we met a few weeks ago. Howells is still a literary arbiter, even if he isn't the editor of The Atlantic anymore. And Howells likes his poetry, particularly the dialect stuff and this exaggerated, quote unquote, Negro dialect of the period. And Howells helps make him famous. Dunbar marries a woman who is as much of a writer and an activist as he is, Alice Ruth Moore. And these are pictures of her at various stages in her life. She was actually married, I think, 3 times. They separated in 1902, mainly due to depression and alcoholism on Dunbar's part, but also because she was a pretty open bisexual person. And this apparently was something that Dunbar couldn't put up with. But anyway, this is what she looked like. We'll see some pictures of Dunbar here in a minute. After Dunbar is dead, the Harlem Renaissance comes along in the 20s, and we'll get to there in a few weeks. And they begin to look at his poetry and think, oh, this is just, shuck and jive, horrible Negro, quote unquote, Negro dialect poetry. It doesn't represent what we really can do. And so his writing gets disparaged for quite some time. And then more recently, we're finding more and more critics who are looking at the formal structure of his poetry and find that it's fascinating. There's 2 poems in the textbook, Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is written as a sonnet. And then he has another poem called We Wear the Mask, about the status of African Americans in a majority white society. And those are probably the 2 best poems in the collection. But they've gained in status and stature well after his death. He dies very young. He's only in his 30s, I think, when he dies in Dayton in 1906 of tuberculosis, which people died from back then. Here's some images of Dunbar. Here's what he looked like when he was in high school and when he was first writing his poems. This is a picture of Dunbar with his mother after he left his wife and returned home. And this is Dunbar the year that he died. This is his study in Dayton in his mother's house. So this might give you a little bit of an idea of what Dunbar looked like. Again, died very young. Was a very prolific author, wrote the first African-American musical theater production called In Dahomey, which is a riot to watch or listen to if you can ever find it, because it's just odd. It's like this weird mixed minstrel show, African stuff, all kind of mixed together. But it's very popular when it was written in 1903. Our third writer and second African American is W.E.B. Du Bois. And he is a contemporary of the other two writers that we're looking at, a little older and then lived forever. He died in his 90s. And you can see different pictures of him at different stages of his life. He's also born in the North, but he's born specifically in Massachusetts, which for an African American in the 19th century is a tremendous advantage because they had none of the kinds of restrictions that we see placed on people in other places. It doesn't mean institutions and cities and towns and governments weren't racist, but they weren't as overtly restrictive as the Jim Crow Deep South and parts of the Midwest. But even so, he's born in Massachusetts. He's still not allowed to get into Harvard, which is his hometown, just in Boston. And so he goes to Fisk University, one of the historically black universities, when he's 18. It's his first time in the South. It's in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's the first time he's confronted with this segregation, and it radicalizes him. He then reapplies to go to Harvard and becomes the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard. The first African American to earn a PhD was actually in physics before the Civil War. But he could never, a particular man's name who just went right out of my head, could never get a job teaching except in high schools that were designed for black students. Again, another prolific writer, prolific activist. He's a major influence on black political and cultural life, especially around the turn of the 20th century. He dabbles with Pan-Africanism. He dabbles with a movement of back to Africa in the 1910s and 20s that was promoted by a guy named Marcus Garvey, who's sort of an extraordinary, bigger-than-life character. Who doesn't leave any literature, but it leaves this great story of trying to develop a shipping line and then a colony in Africa, or an area in Africa that African Americans could move to. It never comes to anything, and he goes bankrupt. But Du Bois supported Garvey in his attempts, although it never went anywhere. There's three things that we probably need to remember about Du Bois, and you'll see that in the selections that we have in our textbook. The first is this idea that African Americans have a double consciousness, that they're both black and American. And because of that, they have to look at the world through these two things that are separate in the sense that white Americans never accept African Americans as full-fledged Americans as they accept themselves. And so Du Bois kind of breaks these two streams of thinking out and says that this is the great paradox that African Americans have to solve. The second thing that he develops is an idea that we still think about, and that is, he said, let's take the talented 10th, the top 10%, the smartest men and women who are African Americans, and let's educate them to be better than whites, to be at least the equal and probably better. And his argument is kind of an elitist one. In the sense that he's talking about, let's let the 90% of African Americans who don't fall into this category, they can kind of fend for themselves. They should vote, they should get an education and all that, but let's concentrate our efforts on creating this talented 10th to become the leaders of the African American community. It's a complicated bit of business. And it frankly sounds like Du Bois is interested in creating people who are like himself, highly educated academics who can write in the extraordinarily fluent ways that Du Bois is able to do. The third thing that we ought to take away from this, and this is also in our textbook, is that Du Bois and Booker T. Washington have this enormous disagreement over what is the role of African Americans? How should they conduct themselves going forward in a time when there's this formal segregation exists, where blacks can't vote, they can't get an education, they can't be treated in a hospital. And so Washington, who's the other great 19th century American black figure, who's also a former slave, he's the man who founds Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, another black institution for higher education, but it's one that focuses on practical things, manual trades, on nursing, not creating physicians or lawyers or liberal arts majors or engineers, but rather the kind of practical trade things that Washington thinks that Black people should be doing. We got to remember that the majority of Americans in the late 19th century are farmers. Over 50% of the population of the United States lives in rural areas and farms. Now it's about 2% of the population farms in the US. So this idea that Washington has is not that far out of line, especially in a time when it's hard for Black people to own land, particularly in the South. And it's hard for them to get loans, and it's hard for them to compete economically against white landowners. But the fight between these two, and this is a picture of Du Bois about the time that he writes The Soul of Black Folk, and the picture of Washington about the time that he asserts this notion that Black people should limit their focus on civil rights and focus more on developing a profession or a trade, is enormous. And we still talk about these things. This is the last slide, and this shows you what we have in our textbook. Again, Du Bois is not a fiction writer. He is an activist, a public speaker, an orator, all those kinds of things. And what we have is from his most influential work, which is The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903. And we have two chapters from there. One is called On Our Spiritual Strivings, and that's where he advances this notion of a double consciousness, or this two-ness, where he sees that education and voting are going to be the keys to getting Black Americans the status they deserve to be accepted as fully developed Americans. That's still a controversial issue, and those of you who spent a lot of time thinking about race relations may find that there's any number of people who talk about, even though they may have gone to Princeton or gone to Harvard or become a lawyer or something, they still have to deal with the innate racism that's in America. But Du Bois argues that they can get out of that box with education and with the ability to vote, which of course in 1903 was highly restricted. Black people couldn't vote anywhere in the South, basically after 1876, after the end of Reconstruction. The second chapter that's in our textbook is where he tackles Booker T. Washington. Washington gives this famous Atlanta Exposition address, and it's in our textbook in 471 to 479. And where he explicitly makes the case and says, we as African Americans should be concentrating on developing manual skills because that's how we can get ahead. And we should stop agitating for the vote. We should give up our civil rights. We should just become farmers and not laborers, but farmers and skilled artisans, which has its own kind of appeal in some ways. It's certainly an issue now, because unions, for instance, are always trying to recruit Black apprentices because they can't find enough people to go into certain trades like plumbing, electric, carpentry. But unions have also been, in many ways, the most exclusionary of American institutions in simply not letting Black apprentices in. Times have changed, and now they do. 40, 50, 60 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. At any rate, this is where Du Bois makes his case against Washington's vision. And Washington, especially as Frederick Douglass gets older, is the African American in the United States. He's the leader, if there is a leader. He's the guy that when people say, what do Black people think? They ask Booker T. Washington, which really irritates people like Du Bois, who has much more education than Washington and a very different vision. But Booker T. Washington is the first African American to have dinner with the president in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt invites him. He's the first person to speak at this Atlanta Exposition. I mean, this is a huge deal when he makes this argument. And he is the public face of Black America for about 20 or 30 years. And of course, Du Bois would rather be the public face. Du Bois is the guy who founds the NAACP. And he's also, as I said, a major activist and writer in addition to that. But the chapter in the textbook is interesting because Du Bois criticizes Booker T. Washington for taking what he sees as an accommodationist approach and basically kowtowing to white people and saying, listen, we're never going to be equal until we can vote our own guys into office. We're never going to be taken seriously unless we have the political power that whites are denying us. And that's the gist of his argument. It's an extraordinary piece of writing. It's the longest chapter in the book. And it's one that talks about the history of slave revolts. It talks about Frederick Douglass. It talks about how active and dynamic and powerful Black people can be when they act together to oppose white supremacy. And that's the fundamental argument that Du Bois makes, is that if we followed what Washington wants us to do, we're going to end up as second-class citizens until the end of time. And that is unnatural for powerful, smart, interesting, aggressive, active Black Americans to be. And so there's a real contrast between Washington and Du Bois. And of course, if you read just Du Bois' thing, you're reading an opponent of Washington's view of his own speech. So you ought to take a look at the exposition address if you have some time to see just what exactly it is that Du Bois is so angry about. But Du Bois does a good job, I think, of summarizing Washington's views and pointing out where it's wrong. Okay, so these are our three other writers from the week, voices that we may not normally hear: a Native American, two African Americans, both of whom grow up in a period where the restrictions, the formal and informal restrictions on African Americans, are so profoundly different from our own time that for many of us, it's almost unimaginable. So I'll be interested to see what you have to say in the discussion board this week.